Most people remember the Beverly Hills Hotel as a pink fantasy of palm trees, movie stars, and discreet luxury. But behind its banana leaf wallpaper stood a system built to erase shame. In 1966, a reclusive billionaire named Howard Hughes checked into a bungalow and refused to leave for 4 years. Room service trays piled outside his door. Studio fixers paid quiet visits. Police reports vanished before sunrise. This hotel did not simply host Hollywood's scandals, it absorbed them. The question is not what happened inside those walls, but who paid to keep it silent. Chapter 1. The Dream Sold to a Desert. Before Hollywood had red carpets, it had a patch of dusty land that needed a fantasy to survive. In 1912, Los Angeles sprawled outward like a gambler's promise. The city limits ended where the streetcar tracks stopped running. Beyond that lay empty bean fields and dirt roads that turned to mud when the winter rains came. A consortium of developers stood at the edge of this nothing and saw fortune. They called the land Beverly Hills, borrowed from a fashionable town back east. The name cost them nothing. The land would cost everyone else everything. The developers faced a basic problem. Who buys a house in the middle of nowhere? The answer arrived in the form of a hotel. Not just any hotel. A monument to what the future might hold. If you build luxury in a desert, wealth will follow. At least that was the theory. Construction began on a Mission Revival building with arched colonnades and clay tile roofs. The structure rose where coyotes still hunted at dusk. They planted palm trees imported from across the state. They dug wells for water and ran power lines from the city. The hotel opened in May of 1912 with 12 acres of manicured gardens and a promise of exclusivity. Room rates started at $2.50 per night. That was more than a laborer earned in 2 days. The strategy was elegant in its manipulation. The hotel served as proof of concept. It told potential buyers that civilization had already arrived, that this dusty tract had crossed some invisible threshold into desirability. Advertisements appeared in newspapers across the country. They showed ladies in white dresses taking tea on shaded terraces. They showed automobiles parked beneath porticos. They did not show the empty lots stretching for miles in every direction. The Beverly Hills Hotel functioned as the nucleus of a real estate fantasy. It created the illusion of an established community where none existed. Every guest who checked in became an unwitting participant in a sales campaign. Their presence validated the developer's claims. Their money funded the infrastructure needed to sell more lots. The hotel was not meant to be profitable on its own. It was bait. Within 2 years, odd lot sales began to climb. Wealthy families from the East Coast purchased property sight unseen based on brochures featuring the hotel. The mechanism worked because it tapped into a fundamental human desire. People want to believe that paradise is just one purchase away. They want to imagine themselves part of an exclusive club. The hotel sold that dream at $2.50 per night. But the fantasy had a cost. The developers incurred massive debts building infrastructure for a town that barely existed. They graded roads. They installed sewage systems. They fought legal battles over water rights with neighboring communities. The hotel hemorrhaged money every month. It survived only because the land sales justified the losses. The building was never the product. It was the advertisement. By 1914, the first permanent residents had moved into Beverly Hills. After they built mansions on hilltops overlooking the hotel. The developers celebrated. They had created value from nothing. They had turned scrubland into real estate, and they had done it by constructing a beautiful lie. The Beverly Hills Hotel was always honest about what it sold. It sold the appearance of arrival. Whether you had actually arrived was irrelevant. The question lingered even then. Was this paradise ever meant to be honest? Chapter 2. When glamour became currency. See, as silent films turned into talkies, fame became a commodity that demanded protection at any cost. Hollywood discovered Beverly Hills the way predators find hunting grounds. The film industry had established itself in Los Angeles during the 1910s, drawn by reliable sunlight and cheap land. By the 1920s, the studios had evolved into industrial empires. They manufactured stars the same way Ford manufactured automobiles, with precision, with control, and with an understanding that the product needed constant maintenance. The Beverly Hills Hotel became essential infrastructure in this new economy. Studio executives needed a place to conduct business away from prying eyes. Actors needed refuge from fans who grew more invasive as celebrity culture intensified. Directors needed neutral ground for sensitive negotiations. The hotel provided all of this, but more importantly, it provided discretion. The studio system operated on a simple principle: image was everything. A star's private life could destroy their market value overnight. Audiences wanted to believe in purity and romance and heroism. They did not want to know about affairs or addictions or preferences that contradicted the manufactured persona. The studios understood this. They built morality clauses into every contract. One scandal could trigger financial penalties worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. In one photograph could end a career. This created an economic imperative for silence. The Beverly Hills Hotel positioned itself as the solution. Management cultivated relationships with studio heads. They hired staff who understood that discretion was not optional. They designed systems to protect valuable assets. A star could check in under a false name. Deliveries arrived through service entrances. Bungalows offered separate access roads. The architecture itself became complicit, yet the numbers justified the arrangement. By 1930, the film industry generated over $100 million annually. A single successful picture could earn $2 million at the box office. Leading actors commanded salaries of $10,000 per week. These were not people. They were investments, and investments required protection. The hotel expanded during this period. New wings added capacity. The bungalow system grew to accommodate demand. Private cottages ringed the main building, each with its own entrance and exit paths. Room rates climbed to match the clientele. A suite cost $15 per night by the mid-1930s. That was a week's wages for most Americans. The price was not a barrier, it was a filter. Studio publicists became regular fixtures in the lobby. They maintained relationships with hotel managers. They knew which reporters could be trusted and which required payment to look elsewhere. They understood the geography of the property, which bungalows offered the most privacy, which exits avoided the main driveway. The hotel became a chessboard where reputation could be defended move by move. Local law enforcement played their role. Beverly Hills had incorporated as an independent city in 1914. The police force remained small and dependent on tax revenue from wealthy residents. When incidents occurred at the hotel, officers arrived with an understanding. Some things were handled quietly. Some reports were filed in drawers that never opened. The system worked because everyone benefited. The studios kept their stars marketable. The hotel kept its reputation. The police kept their budget. This was not conspiracy. It was alignment of interests. The film industry had become Los Angeles's primary economic engine. Anything that threatened the industry threatened the region. Protection became patriotism. Silence became civic duty. By the late 1930s, the Beverly Hills Hotel had transformed from a real estate lure into something more functional. It was a pressure valve for an industry built on impossible standards. It allowed human beings to exist beneath the mythology while preserving the mythology itself. The hotel did not judge. It simply absorbed. And in absorbing, it became indispensable. The question evolved. How image control became more valuable than truth was no longer abstract. It was policy. It was infrastructure. It was the cost of doing business in a town where dreams were manufactured at industrial scale and protected with industrial efficiency. Chapter 3. The Pink Palace Perfected. By the mid-20th century, the hotel no longer sold rooms. It sold invisibility. The transformation happened gradually and then all at once. In 1946, the hotel changed ownership. The new proprietor understood what they had purchased. Not a building, a system. Renovations began immediately, not to modernize, but to perfect. The iconic pink facade arrived in 1948. The color was called desert flower. It was not subtle. The exterior walls glowed like a confection against the California sky. Architects at the time called it garish. Guests called it unforgettable. That was the point. The building needed to be instantly recognizable, a landmark that communicated status before you ever walked through the door. The gardens expanded to cover 12 acres. Landscape designers imported tropical plants from across the Pacific. Banana trees lined walkways. Hibiscus bloomed year-round. The grounds crew maintained the property with obsessive precision. Every hedge trimmed to exact specifications. Every pathway swept before dawn. The visual impression was paradise carefully controlled. The bungalow system reached its final form during this period. The hotel now offered 23 separate cottages scattered across the property. Each functioned as a private residence. Full kitchens, multiple bedrooms, dedicated phone lines. Some included swimming pools hidden behind walls thick enough to muffle sound. Nightly rates for a bungalow reached $50 by 1950. That was more than most families paid for monthly rent. But the infrastructure went deeper than architecture. The hotel employed over 300 staff members by the early 1950s. Bellhops, concierge, housekeepers, valets, gardeners, cooks, security personnel, each hired with specific criteria. Loyalty mattered more than experience. The ability to forget what you saw mattered more than efficiency. Staff turnover remained remarkably low. People who worked at the Beverly Hills Hotel understood they were part of something larger than hospitality. The Polo Lounge opened in 1941. It became the unofficial headquarters of the entertainment industry. Deals were negotiated over lunch. Casting decisions happened at corner booths. The room itself was designed to facilitate conversation while preventing eavesdropping. High-backed leather banquettes created acoustic isolation. Tables were spaced far enough apart that voices did not carry. The lighting was kept deliberately dim. You could see who was present, but not what they were doing. The hotel introduced its signature wallpaper in 1949. Banana leaves on a pale background, designed by a Hollywood set decorator. It appeared in hallways and bungalows and public spaces. The pattern became synonymous with the property. It also served a practical purpose. The busy design obscured imperfections, stains, marks, evidence of nights that went wrong. The wallpaper was beautiful. It was also functional. By 1955, the Beverly Hills Hotel had achieved something remarkable. It had become invisible through visibility. Everyone knew the building existed. Everyone recognized its pink walls and tropical gardens. But no one could see what happened inside. The spectacle was the camouflage. The numbers from this era reveal the scale. Annual revenue exceeded $2 million by the mid-1950s. The property employed 312 staff members during peak season. 23 bungalows commanded rates between $50 and $125 per night. The main building housed 201 rooms, with nightly rates starting at $18. Total capacity reached 400 guests. Occupancy averaged 87% year-round. These were not just statistics. They were the architecture of a machine built to generate profit while maintaining secrecy. The hotel's reputation spread globally. European royalty stayed in the bungalows. Business magnates conducted negotiations in the suites. Every arrival reinforced the mythology. This was the place where power came to rest, where success came to celebrate, where scandal came to hide. But perfection has weight. The infrastructure required to maintain invisibility was expensive. The loyalty that prevented leaks had to be purchased with above-market wages. The renovations needed to preserve the illusion required constant capital. The hotel was profitable. It was also trapped. It could never be anything other than what it had become. The fortress was complete. The dream had reached its peak, and everyone involved understood the bargain. Beauty required maintenance, privacy required payment, and silence required a system that never stopped operating. The question was no longer whether the hotel could sustain this. It was whether anyone wanted it to change. Chapter 4. The bungalows built for discretion. Privacy was not an amenity here. It was the product itself. The bungalows were designed with intent. Each structure sat apart from the main building. Pathways meandered through dense vegetation. Hedges grew taller than a person. Walls blocked sightlines. You could walk from your cottage to a waiting car without ever being seen from another part of the property. This was not accidental landscaping. It was engineered isolation. Bungalow 5 became particularly notorious. It sat at the far western edge of the grounds. A private driveway allowed vehicles to approach from a service road. The entrance faced away from the hotel. Heavy curtains remained drawn even at midday. According to staff members who spoke decades later, strange requests came from that address. Deliveries at odd hours. Instructions to leave items outside without knocking. One housekeeper claimed she serviced the room only when explicitly summoned, sometimes going a week between cleanings. The stories accumulated like sediment. A famous actress allegedly spent 3 months in Bungalow 7 during 1952 while recovering from what publicists called exhaustion. Medical professionals visited through side doors. Photographers who lingered near the property were politely escorted away by hotel security. The studio paid her bill directly. $75 per night for 90 consecutive nights came to $6,750. That equaled the annual salary of a studio department head. The expense was justified. Her next picture earned $3 million at the box office. Bungalow 12 housed multiple incidents that never became public until years after they occurred. One involved a young contract player found unconscious after mixing prescription medication with alcohol. A doctor arrived before the ambulance. No police report was filed. The actor was quietly transported to a private facility. Studio lawyers visited the hotel within hours. According to one security guard interviewed in the 1980s, he was instructed to forget the night had happened. He kept his job for another 20 years. These were not isolated events. They were the operational reality. The bungalows existed to absorb crisis, to transform scandal into manageable logistics. The architecture facilitated this. Multiple exits, soundproofed walls, staff trained to follow specific protocols. When something went wrong, the hotel did not react. It processed. The mechanics were surprisingly straightforward. Stars arrived under pseudonyms. Reservations were made by assistants using generic business names. Check-in happened through service areas. Room service delivered meals on covered trays that could be left outside without direct contact. Housekeeping entered only when authorized. Phone calls were routed through switchboard operators who understood which names to never repeat. But discretion was not free. The bungalows commanded premium rates precisely because of what they offered. By 1960, nightly costs ranged from $100 to $300 depending on size and location. Some studios maintained permanent reservations. They paid for access whether they used it or not. Call it insurance, call it investment. The accounting departments categorized it as public relations expense. What did privacy really protect? The obvious answer was reputation. A married actor conducting an affair needed somewhere safe. An actress struggling with addiction needed somewhere private to fall apart. A director facing allegations needed somewhere to negotiate settlements. The bungalows provided physical space for moral compromise to occur without consequence. But the protection ran deeper. The hotel preserved the economic machinery of the studio system. Every crisis avoided was a picture that stayed in production. Nor every scandal contained was a contract that remained valid. The morality clauses built into star agreements created a direct financial link between personal behavior and corporate revenue. One photograph of the wrong person in the wrong situation could trigger penalties worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, could halt production on a film that had already spent millions, could destroy years of marketing investment in a carefully constructed public image. The bungalows were not indulgent. Yeah, they were pragmatic. They reduced risk. They protected assets. And they did it so well that most people never knew there was anything to protect. Some incidents did leak out. Rumors circulated about wild parties, about violence, about death. But rumors without evidence are just stories, and stories without photographs are just words. The hotel understood this. Its architecture was built on the principle that if something cannot be proven, it did not happen, at least not officially. Its staff members who worked the bungalows during the 1950s and 60s later described a strange atmosphere. The cottages felt separate from the rest of the property. Time moved differently. Normal rules did not apply. One gardener recalled pruning roses outside Bungalow 8 while hearing what sounded like furniture breaking inside. He was told to finish his work elsewhere. He never asked questions. Another employee remembered being called to deliver fresh linens to a bungalow at 3 in the morning. When he arrived, a man in an expensive suit met him at the door, took the linens, handed him a $50 bill, told him the delivery never happened. The worker earned $30 per week. He forgot the delivery. This was the system at its most efficient. Small transactions multiplied across years created an environment where silence was automatic, where discretion was reflex, where everyone understood that what happened in the bungalows stayed in the bungalows, not because of threats, because of incentives. The question remained, what did privacy really protect? It protected the machinery, it protected the illusion, it protected the business model. And it did so with such effectiveness that the hotel became more than a building. It became a technology for managing truth. Chapter 5. The Fixers Who Rewrote the Night. When something went wrong, its men with briefcases arrived before the ambulance did. The fixers worked in the gray space between disaster and denial. They were not hotel employees. They worked for the studios. But they maintained permanent relationships with hotel management. They knew which staff members could be trusted, which security guards understood the arrangement, which service entrances offered the most privacy. They operated with a specific mandate: protect the asset at any cost. The economics justified their existence. A major star could generate $10 million in box office revenue across 3 pictures. Negative publicity could reduce that by half. The studios calculated risk precisely. Employing a full-time fixer cost perhaps $20,000 annually. Losing half the revenue from a bankable star cost $5 million. The math was not complicated. These men came from varied backgrounds. Some were former police officers, yet others had worked as private investigators. A few had legal training. What they shared was an understanding of how systems worked and where those systems had gaps. How to make a police report disappear. How to persuade a witness to remember events differently. How to ensure a story never reached a newspaper editor. This was not violence. It was negotiation backed by economic leverage. The hotel functioned as their operational headquarters. They maintained contact information for key staff. When a call came, response time was measured in minutes. A typical intervention followed a pattern. The alert went out. The fixer arrived. Assessment happened quickly. Was this containable? What resources were needed? Who needed to be involved? If the situation required medical attention, private doctors were summoned. These physicians understood patient confidentiality in absolute terms. They treated injuries without asking questions. They prescribed medication without documentation. They made problems disappear into professional discretion. Their fees reflected the service. A house call could cost $500 in 1960. That was more than most doctors earned in a week. But the studios paid without hesitation. If the situation involved potential criminal charges, lawyers appeared, not criminal defense attorneys, specialists in negotiation and settlement. They met with hotel management first, established what evidence existed, in which staff members had witnessed events, what physical documentation might create problems. Then they began erasing. Paperwork went missing. Witnesses remembered differently. Security footage, if it existed, was recorded over. The incident transformed from documented fact to disputed claim. Local police cooperation was essential. Beverly Hills maintained a force of approximately 40 officers during the 1950s and 60s. The department operated on a budget heavily dependent on tax revenue from wealthy residents and businesses. The Beverly Hills Hotel represented significant economic activity, employment, taxes, prestige. When officers responded to calls at the property, they understood context. Some situations required official action, others required discretion. The difference was communicated quietly. One retired officer interviewed in the 1990s described the dynamic. He recalled arriving at the hotel after reports of a disturbance in a bungalow. Upon arrival, he found a studio representative already present. The situation was explained. A star had become intoxicated. Property damage occurred, but no injuries, no threat to public safety. The studio would cover all costs, would ensure it did not happen again. The officer filed a report categorizing the incident as a noise complaint. No names, no details. The report disappeared into a filing cabinet and was never referenced again. The financial scale of these operations was substantial. Studio legal departments' budgets for the 1950s show line items for discretionary settlements ranging from $50,000 to $200,000 annually. These were payments made to resolve situations before they became public. Hotel damages, medical bills, payments to individuals who agreed to forget what they saw. The money flowed through intermediaries, lawyers, accountants, fixers who specialized in making numbers disappear into categories like consulting fees or location expenses. The system worked because it was decentralized. No single person knew everything. Hotel staff saw fragments. Police responded to isolated incidents. Doctors treated specific injuries. Lawyers handled individual cases. The fixers moved between these worlds, connecting the pieces. They were the ones who saw the pattern, who understood that what looked like isolated incidents were actually the operational cost of an industry built on impossible standards. One fixer, who spoke anonymously in the 1980s, estimated he handled between 30 and 50 situations per year during his tenure from 1956 to 1968. Simple math produces troubling totals. 30 incidents annually across 12 years equals 360 interventions. If that number was typical across multiple fixers working for different studios, the scale becomes clear. Hundreds of situations contained, hundreds of stories that never became public, hundreds of nights rewritten. The Beverly Hills Hotel was not unique. Other properties offered similar services, but the hotel's infrastructure made it particularly effective. The bungalows, the loyal staff, the established relationships with local authorities, the reputation for discretion. All of these elements combined into something greater than their sum. The hotel became a machine for transforming scandal into manageable expense. Who was truly in control? The question had no simple answer. The studios paid the bills. The fixers executed the operations. The hotel provided the venue. Local authorities enabled the system. But no single entity controlled the whole apparatus. It was emergent, self-organizing. Each participant acted in their own interest, and their interests aligned perfectly around a shared goal: protect the mythology at any cost. The tension was always there beneath the surface, because the system required silence, and silence required constant maintenance, and maintenance required resources, and resources required profit, and profit required the mythology to remain intact. One break in the chain threatened everything, so the chain was never allowed to break. The fixers understood this better than anyone. They were the ones who showed up at 3 a.m, who negotiated with crying witnesses, who calculated exactly how much it cost to make someone forget. They knew the precise price of silence, and they paid it again and again and again. Chapter 6: The Recluse Behind Closed Curtains. In 1966, Howard Hughes entered a bungalow and began to disappear in plain sight. Hughes arrived on Thanksgiving Day. 4 black limousines pulled up to a service entrance. Men in dark suits emerged first. They scanned the area, checked the pathways, secured the perimeter. Then Hughes himself appeared, thin, disheveled, moving with the careful steps of someone conserving energy. He walked into bungalows 4 and 5. They had been connected into a single suite. He would not leave for 4 years. The man who checked into the Beverly Hills Hotel in 1966 was already a legend. Aviation pioneer, film producer, business magnate. His wealth was estimated at over $1 billion. He controlled Trans World Airlines. He owned substantial real estate across Las Vegas. He had produced successful Hollywood films. His life story, read like American mythology, made flesh. But mythology has a breaking point. Hughes had been deteriorating for years. Associates noticed increasing paranoia, strange demands, obsessive behaviors. By the mid-1960s, his mental state had declined to the point where normal functioning became impossible. He trusted almost no one. He refused to be photographed. He communicated primarily through handwritten memos passed to a small circle of aides. The bungalows at the Beverly Hills Hotel became his fortress against a world he no longer recognized. The conditions inside were documented later through legal depositions. Curtains remained drawn 24 hours a day. Windows were sealed with tape. Hughes insisted on specific temperature controls. He wore the same clothes for weeks. He watched movies repeatedly, old films from the 1930s and 40s. The projector ran at all hours. Staff were instructed to leave food outside the door. He rarely ate. But even in isolation, Hughes conducted business. Telephone calls went out daily. He negotiated deals worth millions of dollars, purchased properties, directed corporate strategy. The disconnect was profound. A man who could barely manage basic self-care was simultaneously controlling vast business interests. The bungalow became the command center for an empire run by someone who had stopped participating in ordinary reality. Hotel staff who worked during this period described an eerie atmosphere. The bungalows sat dark and silent. Room service trays accumulated outside the door. Sometimes they would sit for days before being collected. Housekeeping was rarely allowed inside. When they were, they found stacks of newspapers, empty tissue boxes, prescription medication bottles. The smell was described as stale and medicinal. Security around the bungalows intensified. Hughes's personal team established protocols. No hotel staff could approach without clearance. Deliveries were screened. Visitors were interrogated. The men who guarded the perimeter were not hotel employees. They worked for Hughes. They were paid to maintain absolute isolation. And they did. The financial arrangement was straightforward. Hughes paid in advance. Cash, months at a time. The hotel management asked no questions. 2 bungalows at $300 per night came to $600 daily. Over a month, that totaled $18,000. Over a year, it reached $216,000. For 4 years, the total exceeded $860,000. That was revenue the hotel could not refuse. But the presence created complications. Other guests complained about the security, about armed men in the gardens, about the strange secrecy surrounding entire sections of the property. Management fielded these concerns carefully. They emphasized privacy. They reminded guests that discretion was a founding principle. They offered complimentary upgrades. The complaints faded. The revenue continued. Hughes's isolation became more complete as months turned to years. He stopped taking most phone calls. He communicated almost exclusively through written notes. His handwriting deteriorated. The memos became increasingly difficult to read. His instructions grew more paranoid. He demanded staff be tested for diseases. He required multiple layers of tissue paper between his hand and any object he touched. The mental decline was obvious to anyone who witnessed it, but witnessing required access, and access was denied. The maximum tension arrived in 1969. Hughes had been in the bungalow for over 3 years. Rumors had spread through Hollywood, whispers about his condition, questions about who was actually running his companies. Journalists began making inquiries. Photographers camped outside the hotel, hoping for a glimpse. The pressure mounted. Hughes's aides went into crisis mode. They leaked carefully controlled information. They arranged for staged phone calls with business associates. They maintained the fiction that Hughes remained in command. The performance was elaborate, but it worked. The media attention faded. The questions stopped. Hughes remained hidden. Inside the bungalow, time had stopped meaning anything. Days blurred together. Hughes watched the same films over and over, ate sporadically, slept at random hours. His physical health continued to decline. He lost weight. His hair and nails grew long. He developed bed sores. But medical intervention was minimal. He trusted few doctors. He believed most medicine was poison, so he simply existed, neither living nor dying, suspended in a luxury prison of his own design. If a billionaire could vanish inside a hotel, what did that say about its power? The question was not rhetorical. Hughes represented the extreme edge of what the Beverly Hills Hotel enabled. Total isolation, complete privacy, absolute discretion. The hotel had been designed to protect celebrities from scandal. It had evolved into something that could hide a human being from the world entirely. The staff who worked the property during those years carried the memory of it. The dark bungalows, the armed guards, the sense that something profoundly wrong was happening just out of sight. But they said nothing. They had been trained to say nothing. And saying nothing was what they were paid to do. Hughes finally left in November of 1970. Not by choice. The hotel was sold. A new ownership wanted him gone. His aides arranged transport to the Bahamas. He was carried out on a stretcher at night. Thin, frail, barely conscious. He never returned to Los Angeles. The bungalows were renovated immediately. Everything inside was removed. Carpet, wallpaper, furniture. The rooms were stripped to bare walls and rebuilt, as if erasing the physical space could erase what had happened there. As if fresh paint could cover 4 years of slow dissolution. But the question remained, what the hotel had allowed to occur, what it had facilitated through its systems of privacy and discretion. Howard Hughes had disappeared in plain sight, and no one had stopped it, because stopping it would have required breaking the fundamental rule. What happens in the bungalows stays in the bungalows. The system had worked exactly as designed, even when working meant enabling a man to destroy himself in isolation, even when privacy became imprisonment, even when discretion became neglect. That was the true cost, not the $860,000 Hughes paid, but the moral compromise required to take the money and look away. Chapter 7. When the system began to crack. By the late 1960s, the old studio machine was losing its grip on culture. The collapse started quietly, a shift in the wind, a change in what audiences wanted. The studio system that had dominated Hollywood for 4 decades began to fracture. The mechanisms that had protected stars and controlled narratives lost their effectiveness. And the Beverly Hills Hotel found itself defending a model that no longer matched reality. Television changed everything. By 1965, 92% of American households owned at least one television set. The evening news brought cameras into living rooms. Journalists began asking harder questions. The cozy relationship between studios and entertainment reporters eroded. A new generation of journalists viewed celebrity coverage differently. They saw investigation, not collaboration. The morality clauses that studios had used to control actors became unenforceable. Stars gained power. They hired their own agents and lawyers. They negotiated contracts that gave them creative control. They stopped accepting the old bargain, where personal freedom was traded for professional success. When scandals emerged, they fought back publicly instead of allowing fixers to bury the story. The numbers reflected the transition. In 1950, the 5 major studios controlled 85% of film production and distribution. By 1970, that number had dropped to 40%. Independent producers gained market share. Foreign films attracted audiences. The vertical integration that had made the studio system so powerful was ruled illegal by antitrust courts. The empire fragmented into smaller kingdoms. The Beverly Hills Hotel felt the shift. Occupancy rates declined from 87% in 1960 to 73% by 1972. Revenue stagnated. Operating costs continued to rise. The property needed renovation. The infrastructure that had seemed so permanent began to show age. Plumbing problems, electrical issues, deferred maintenance that could no longer be ignored. But the real crisis was relevance. The hotel had built its reputation on discretion during an era when discretion was essential. Now discretion felt less like service and more like complicity. Younger guests questioned why privacy required such elaborate systems. What was being hidden? Who benefited from the hiding? The political climate intensified the scrutiny. The late 1960s brought protests, civil rights movements, anti-war demonstrations. Questioning authority became mainstream. Institutions that had operated on implicit trust found themselves defending practices they had never needed to explain. The Beverly Hills Hotel was no exception. Journalists began investigating old stories. Incidents that had been buried resurfaced. Former staff members gave interviews. They described the bungalows, the strange requests, the men in suits who arrived at odd hours, the pattern of silence. Most accounts were vague, lacking specific names or dates. But the cumulative effect was damaging. The hotel's mystique began to feel sinister. One reporter in 1973 published a piece examining the relationship between Hollywood and local law enforcement. The article mentioned the Beverly Hills Hotel specifically, referenced complaints that had been filed and then disappeared. Detailed payments made to settle potential lawsuits. The hotel management responded with a terse statement about guest privacy. But the damage lingered. The economic model became harder to sustain. The bungalows had always been subsidized by mystique. Guests paid premium rates because of what those rates implied: access, exclusivity, protection. But as the culture shifted, protection started to look like cover-up. Exclusivity felt like elitism. The product the hotel sold was becoming less valuable. Ownership changed hands in 1970. The new buyers paid $13 million. That was a substantial sum, but it was less than expected. Appraisers had valued the property at $16 million. The gap reflected uncertainty about the future. The Beverly Hills Hotel was still profitable, still famous. But the trajectory had reversed. Growth had stopped. Decline loomed. The new management tried to adapt. They renovated public spaces, updated room decor, hired new staff. But they faced a fundamental problem. The hotel's identity was built on practices that no longer aligned with changing social values. How do you rebrand discretion? How do you market a history of silence? Some guests remained loyal. Old Hollywood still checked in. Business executives still conducted negotiations in the Polo Lounge. But the younger generation of celebrities looked elsewhere. They wanted hotels that felt modern, that embraced transparency, that did not carry the weight of so much hidden history. The cultural moment had shifted. Watergate exposed government lies. Vietnam revealed the cost of official narratives. Audiences began to distrust institutions that claimed to operate for their protection. The Beverly Hills Hotel represented everything this new consciousness rejected: secrecy, elite privilege, unaccountable power. Staff morale suffered. Employees who had spent decades perfecting discretion found themselves questioned. Were they enablers? Had their silence protected wrongdoing? The pride they had taken in professional loyalty felt suddenly complicated. Some quit, others stayed, but carried the weight differently. The hotel tried to control the narrative. They emphasized glamour over secrecy. They marketed the pink facade and tropical gardens. They created promotional materials highlighting famous guests from the past. But every celebration of history risked reminding people of what else had happened. The mythology that had protected the hotel for decades became a liability. By 1975, the Beverly Hills Hotel faced an identity crisis. It could not go back to being what it was. The old system had collapsed. The studios no longer controlled culture. The fixers had mostly retired. The police cooperation had become a political risk. Everything that had made the hotel essential had evaporated, but it also could not move forward without addressing its past. The building stood as physical evidence of decades of compromise. Every bungalow held memories. Every hallway carried echoes. The banana leaf wallpaper had witnessed too much. Renovation could not erase that. Fresh paint could not rewrite history. The hotel had to adapt or risk irrelevance. The question was whether an institution built on silence could survive transparency. Whether a palace constructed to hide scandal could exist in an era that demanded accountability. Whether the pink walls could stand once people understood what they had contained. The system was cracking. What came next would determine whether the Beverly Hills Hotel became a monument or a cautionary tale. Chapter 8: Ghost Stories in a Luxury Suite. Guests began to whisper that certain rooms felt heavy, as if memory itself lingered in the wallpaper. The haunting started as rumor. A guest in Bungalow 8 reported hearing footsteps in the hallway at 3 in the morning. When they checked, no one was there. Another visitor claimed the temperature in their suite dropped suddenly without explanation. Staff noticed. Guests noticed. The stories multiplied. Bungalow 5 developed a particular reputation. The cottage where Howard Hughes had lived in isolation. Guests who stayed there after his departure reported strange experiences. Shadows moving in peripheral vision. The sound of someone pacing. A feeling of being watched. One visitor checked out after a single night. They told the front desk the room felt oppressive, wrong somehow. They refused to provide details. The hotel management faced a decision: dismiss the claims or acknowledge them. Dismissal risked seeming defensive. Acknowledgement risked validating something that could damage the property's appeal. They chose a middle path, neither confirming nor denying, simply noting that historic buildings often carry atmosphere. But the stories persisted. A housekeeper reported that items in certain bungalows would be moved overnight, not dramatically, small changes. A chair shifted, a picture frame tilted. She kept quiet for months. Eventually told a supervisor. Was told old buildings settle, floorboards shift. Nothing supernatural, just physics. Another account came from a maintenance worker. He was repairing a sink in one of the older bungalows late at night. Heard what sounded like a woman crying. He searched the adjacent rooms, found no one. The sound continued. He finished his work quickly and left. Never mentioned it officially. Told his co-workers over drinks. The paranormal claims clustered around specific locations. Bungalows 4 and 5, 8, 12. These were the cottages with the darkest rumored histories. The places where incidents had supposedly occurred decades earlier. Where overdoses had been contained. Where affairs had concluded badly. The correlation between haunting reports and troubled history was difficult to ignore. Skeptics offered rational explanations. The bungalows were old structures, wood contracts, and expands with temperature changes. That creates sounds, footsteps, creaking, groans. The ventilation systems in older buildings produce uneven heating and cooling. That explains sudden temperature shifts. Human psychology fills gaps with narrative. We see patterns where none exist, hear meaning in random noise. The architecture itself contributed to the atmosphere. The bungalows sat isolated from each other, surrounded by dense vegetation. The pathways were poorly lit. Palm fronds created shadows that moved with the wind. At night, the property transformed. What felt luxurious during the day became eerie after dark. Context shaped perception. But some experiences resisted easy explanation. Multiple guests reported the same phenomenon in Bungalow 5, a sense of profound sadness, not fear, not threat, in just overwhelming melancholy. They described it independently, used similar language, felt heavy, oppressive. One guest wrote in a review that staying there felt like intruding on private grief. The hotel began using the stories carefully. They did not advertise haunting, but they did not discourage the whispers either. Mystery added to mystique. Ghost stories became part of the lore. Guests who wanted that experience could request specific rooms. The hotel accommodated. Discreetly. Your tour started to include paranormal elements. Not officially, but guides would mention in passing that certain rooms had interesting histories, that guests had reported unusual experiences. The phrasing was careful, never confirming, never claiming, just acknowledging that some people believed. The psychology of hauntings is well documented. Historic locations accumulate emotional weight. Visitors arrive with expectations. Those expectations shape perception. If you believe a room is haunted, you notice sounds you would otherwise ignore. You interpret ordinary events as supernatural. The belief creates the experience. But belief is powerful. Whether the haunting is real or constructed matters less than its effect. Guests who experienced something in those bungalows carried the memory. They told friends, posted online. The stories spread. And with each retelling, the Beverly Hills Hotel became more than a building. It became a repository for something beyond architecture that some staff members believed. They had worked the property for years, seen too many coincidences, felt too many strange moments. They developed rituals, avoided certain bungalows at certain times, spoke carefully when alone, respected the space, not from fear, from acknowledgement that the building held history, and history has weight. Others remained skeptical, pointed to the obvious explanations. Old buildings make noise. Human imagination fills silence. The haunting narrative served commercial interests, created intrigue, drew certain guests. It was marketing disguised as mystery. The truth likely exists in the space between. The bungalows absorb decades of human experience, joy and despair, success and failure, love and betrayal, isolation and connection. That accumulation leaves something, not ghosts, but resonance. The building remembers in its own way, through the sounds it makes, the way light falls through windows, the atmosphere that persists when you walk through a door. Is the haunting real, or is it guilt given a narrative? The question is unanswerable. Guilt is real. The things that happened in those rooms are documented, not paranormally, historically, verifiably. The haunting might simply be the appropriate response to that knowledge. The emotional weight of understanding what transpired behind those walls. The hotel still stands. Guests still report experiences. A staff still exchange knowing glances when certain rooms are mentioned. The stories continue, not because they can be proven, but because they feel true, because they match the history, because a building that absorbed so much scandal should carry marks. The paranormal claims serve a function. They allow discussion of the hotel's past without direct accusation. Ghost stories are safer than investigations, more marketable than controversy. They transform discomfort into entertainment, complicity into narrative. Whether you believe the bungalows are haunted depends on what you mean by haunting. If haunting means supernatural entities, the evidence is thin. If haunting means the persistence of memory in physical space, the case is stronger. The Beverly Hills Hotel is haunted by its own history, by the decisions made in those rooms, by the silences that were purchased, by the system that made it all possible. And that kind of haunting does not require belief in ghosts. It only requires acknowledgement of what happened and a willingness to feel the weight of it. Chapter 9, The Price of a Tarnished Crown. Even legends lose value when the illusion starts to fade. The financial trouble began quietly. Occupancy rates that dipped below expectations. Revenue that failed to match projections. Operating costs that climbed faster than income. By the late 1970s, the Beverly Hills Hotel was profitable but fragile. The margins had shrunk. The buffer had disappeared. The property changed ownership again in 1979. The new buyer paid $28 million, double what it sold for 9 years earlier. But the debt burden was substantial. The hotel needed capital investment. Major renovations could no longer be deferred. The electrical system dated to the 1940s. The plumbing required constant repairs. The facade needed work. Estimates suggested $15 million minimum for essential updates. The ownership calculated return on investment. The hotel generated approximately $12 million in annual revenue. Operating expenses consumed $8 million. That left $4 million in profit before debt service. With a $28 million purchase price and $15 million in renovation needs, the payback period stretched beyond a decade. That was longer than most investors preferred. But the real crisis arrived in 1982. The hotel became entangled in political controversy. The ownership had ties to foreign investors. Those investors had connections to governments with controversial human rights records. Activists called for boycotts. Protests appeared outside the property. Celebrities who had made the Polo Lounge their headquarters stopped visiting. The boycott gained momentum. Major talent agencies instructed their clients to stay elsewhere. Film studios moved business lunches to competing hotels, an award show after parties relocated. The cultural arbiters who had made the Beverly Hills Hotel essential turned away. Revenue collapsed. In 1983, occupancy fell to 54%. That was the lowest rate since the hotel opened. Annual revenue dropped to $8 million. Operating expenses remained at $7 million. The profit margin evaporated. The hotel was losing money. Management tried to respond. They offered discounted rates, launched marketing campaigns. Now emphasize the property's history and glamour. Nothing worked. The boycott had reframed the narrative. Staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel was no longer chic. It was political, and most guests wanted their vacations apolitical. The numbers from this period reveal the scale of decline. In 1979, the hotel employed 340 staff. By 1984, that number had dropped to 190. In room rates that had averaged $200 per night fell to $120. The Polo Lounge saw revenues decline by 60%. Bungalow bookings, once the most profitable segment, dropped by 75%. The property fell into disrepair. Maintenance budgets were slashed. Landscaping suffered. Paint peeled. The pink facade that had glowed so brightly in the 1950s looked faded and tired. The tropical gardens grew wild. The infrastructure that had seemed so permanent began to crumble. Staff morale collapsed along with revenue. Employees faced layoffs. Those who remained took pay cuts. The pride that had defined service at the hotel turned to resentment. Workers who had spent decades maintaining discretion now wondered if loyalty had been worth it. The hotel had promised security, delivered instability. The ownership considered selling, but finding buyers proved difficult. The property carried too much political baggage. The physical plant needed too much investment. The brand had suffered too much damage. Appraisers valued the hotel at $18 million, $10 million less than it sold for just 5 years earlier. Potential buyers offered even less. The climax arrived in 1985. The hotel declared bankruptcy protection, not full bankruptcy. A restructuring intended to renegotiate debt and allow time for recovery. But the symbolism was devastating. The Beverly Hills Hotel, once the symbol of Hollywood glamour, could not pay its bills. Media coverage was harsh. Articles detailed the property's decline, compared old photographs of celebrities and luxury with current images of empty lobbies and closed bungalows. The narrative was irresistible: a fallen palace, a tarnished crown, proof that even legends die. But something unexpected happened during the bankruptcy process. The controversy that had damaged the hotel also reminded people why it mattered. The boycotts forced conversation about the property's history. Journalists investigated. They uncovered stories about the studio era, about the bungalows and the fixers, about Howard Hughes and his long isolation. This attention reframed the hotel. It was no longer just a luxury property in financial trouble. It was a historical artifact, a window into Hollywood's hidden past. The scandal became scholarship. The controversy became cultural significance. Preservationists rallied. They argued the hotel should be protected, not despite its troubled history, but because of it. The building told a story about power and celebrity and moral compromise. That story deserved to be preserved, even if it was uncomfortable. The bankruptcy court agreed to a reorganization plan. New investors would take control, assume the debt, fund necessary renovations, but the property would remain intact. The bungalows would be preserved, the pink facade would be restored, the hotel would survive. The price was steep. The new owners paid just $14 million for a property that had sold for $28 million 6 years earlier. Existing creditors took losses. Staff pensions were restructured. The hotel emerged from bankruptcy lighter and diminished, but it emerged. By 1987, renovations began. $50 million invested over 3 years. The electrical system was completely replaced. Plumbing updated. The facade repainted. Gardens replanted. The infrastructure rebuilt from foundation to roof. The question throughout this crisis was whether an institution built on silence could survive transparency. The answer arrived gradually. The hotel could survive, but only by transforming, by acknowledging rather than hiding, by selling history instead of discretion. The palace was tarnished, the crown cracked, but the structure stood. Because beneath the controversy and scandal and financial collapse, the building itself remained. And buildings, unlike reputations, can be restored. The price of that restoration was more than $50 million. It was the admission that the old model was dead, that the hotel could no longer function as it had, that the system which had made it essential had collapsed beyond repair. What emerged from bankruptcy was not the same hotel. It looked similar. The pink walls, the banana leaf wallpaper, the bungalows. But the meaning had changed. The Beverly Hills Hotel was no longer a machine for hiding scandal. It was a museum of when such machines existed. And museums, unlike hideouts, invite scrutiny. They require explanation. They demand context. The transformation was complete. The question was whether anyone would pay to visit. Chapter 10. Reinventing the Palace of Secrets. Restoration crews arrived not to erase the past, but to polish it. The renovation began in 1987 with a philosophy that surprised observers. Instead of modernizing away from the property's controversial history, the new ownership leaned into it. They understood something important. The hotel's value was not despite its past. It was because of its past. Architects studied original blueprints from 1912. They examined photographs from the 1920s and 30s. They interviewed former staff members. The goal was not to create something new. It was to restore what had been, to return the property to its peak. The 1950s became the reference point, the era when the hotel's systems functioned most efficiently, when discretion and glamour existed in perfect balance. The bungalows received particular attention. Each cottage was stripped to studs, infrastructure updated. But the layouts remained unchanged. The separate entrances, the private pathways, the architectural features that had enabled privacy, all preserved because those features now represented history rather than active service. The banana leaf wallpaper returned, reproduced from original samples, same pattern, same palette, installed throughout the property. The wallpaper had become iconic, associated with the hotel in public imagination. But now it served a different function. Not camouflage for imperfection, but celebration of continuity. The Polo Lounge was completely rebuilt. Same floor plan, same booth configuration, same lighting design. But everything new underneath. Modern kitchen equipment, updated ventilation, current health and safety codes met without compromising aesthetic. The result looked identical to photographs from 1960, but functioned like 1990. The pink facade received the most care. Color specialists analyzed paint samples. They identified the exact shade of desert flower used in 1948, mixed new batches, applied multiple coats. The building glowed again, visible from blocks away. A beacon, a landmark, exactly as intended. The gardens were replanted using historic records, palm trees, hibiscus, tropical plants arranged in patterns that matched old photographs, pathways relayed with original stone, water features restored, 12 acres transformed back into paradise, manufactured paradise. But paradise nonetheless. The financial investment was substantial, $50 million over 3 years. That exceeded the hotel's purchase price by more than 3 times. The new owners justified the expense with projections. A fully restored Beverly Hills hotel could command premium rates, could reclaim its position in the luxury market, could generate revenue that justified the capital expense. But the restoration was about more than money. It was about narrative control. That the hotel needed to reframe its story, to acknowledge its past while repositioning for the future. The physical renovation created space for that reframing. Fresh paint covered old sins. New infrastructure supported old myths. Staff training became crucial. Employees were taught the hotel's history, but a curated version. They learned about famous guests from the Golden Age, about the architectural significance, about the role the property played in Hollywood's evolution. Or they did not learn about the fixers, about police reports that disappeared, about specific incidents in specific bungalows. The selective history was deliberate. The hotel needed to own its past without being owned by it, to acknowledge glamour without admitting complicity, to celebrate discretion without confessing to what that discretion had protected. The balance was delicate. Public relations carefully managed the reopening. Press releases emphasized restoration, heritage, in a preservation of an important cultural landmark. They used language about honoring the past while embracing the future. Photographs showed the pink facade glowing under California sun, the lush gardens, the elegant interiors. What they did not show were the bungalows where Howard Hughes had isolated himself, the rooms where overdoses had been quietly managed, the service entrances where studio fixers had arrived in the middle of the night. Those spaces existed. They were part of the property, but they were not part of the marketing. The reopening happened in 1990, a carefully orchestrated event. Celebrities attended, not the biggest stars, but recognizable faces, enough to generate coverage, enough to signal that the hotel had been welcomed back into the fold. The boycott was over. The controversy had faded. The Beverly Hills Hotel was relevant again. Room rates reflected the renovation investment. Suites started at $350 per night. Bungalows ranged from $700 to $1,500. The Polo Lounge menu featured entrees priced at $40 to $60. These were premium numbers, comparable to the best hotels in Los Angeles. The property was positioned at the top of the market. Occupancy recovered quickly. Within 2 years, the hotel achieved 78% average occupancy. Revenue climbed to $22 million annually. The investment began to pay returns. The financial model stabilized. The hotel was viable again, but viability required constant curation. The property could not simply exist. It had to be managed, presented, explained. Every tour given, every article written, every photograph published, all contributed to the narrative the hotel needed to project. What is remembered and what is omitted? The question defined the restoration. The hotel remembered glamour, remembered celebrity, remembered luxury. It omitted the machinery that had sustained those things. It omitted the cover-ups, omitted the human cost. This was not dishonesty, it was selective emphasis. Every institution does it. Museums highlight certain artifacts and minimize others. Historic homes emphasize architectural beauty over labor conditions. The Beverly Hills Hotel simply followed that pattern, presented the parts of its history that enhanced value, minimized the parts that created liability. The restoration succeeded because it gave people what they wanted, a connection to Hollywood's golden age, a tangible link to when movies were glamorous and stars were mysterious. The hotel provided that link, authentic in its architecture, authentic in its aesthetics. The authenticity of the experience mattered more than the completeness of the history. By the mid-1990s, the Beverly Hills Hotel had stabilized its position. It was profitable, prestigious, relevant. The restoration had worked. The property that had nearly collapsed a decade earlier now thrived. The question was whether this represented redemption or just successful rebranding. Whether acknowledging history while omitting its ugliest parts was honest enough. Whether a building could be both monument and warning. The answer depended on who you asked and what you wanted from the past. Chapter 11. The business of remembering selectively. In luxury hospitality, memory can be edited as carefully as a film. The hotel's transformation into heritage brand accelerated through the 1990s and 2000s. Management realized they were not selling rooms. They were selling access to a mythology. Every element of the guest experience was designed to reinforce that mythology. And every element omitted details that complicated it. Guided tours began in 1995, offered to guests and occasionally to the public. A hotel historian, specifically hired for the role, and led groups through the property. They walked the gardens, viewed the bungalows from outside, stood in the polo lounge. The narrative emphasized glamour and famous guests. Marilyn Monroe swam in the pool. Elizabeth Taylor celebrated birthdays in the bungalows. Frank Sinatra held court at his regular table. These stories were true, but incomplete. The tours did not mention what else happened in those bungalows. Did not explain why certain celebrities needed so much privacy. Did not discuss the systems that made discretion possible. The history presented was accurate, but partial. Every fact carefully selected to enhance rather than trouble the experience. Merchandise capitalized on nostalgia. The hotel sold coffee table books featuring vintage photographs, reproductions of old menus, luggage tags emblazoned with the pink facade, bathrobes with the hotel logo. Each item reinforced the brand. Each purchase allowed guests to take the mythology home. The coffee table books were particularly revealing. Page after page of beautiful photographs. Movie stars lounging by the pool in the 1950s. Elegant parties on the terrace. The lush gardens in full bloom. The captions identified celebrities and dates. They described fashion and social customs. What they did not describe was context. Why those celebrities needed a private refuge. What they were escaping. What the hotel protected them from. On one book included a photograph of Howard Hughes from the 1940s. Young, handsome, standing next to an airplane. The caption mentioned his aviation achievements, his film production success. It did not mention that he would spend 4 years in isolation in one of the bungalows, that he would deteriorate mentally and physically while hotel staff left food outside his door. That information existed elsewhere, but not in the coffee table book celebrating glamour. The hotel created signature experiences that monetized nostalgia. A Marilyn Monroe package included champagne and strawberries in a suite decorated with photographs of the actress. A Frank Sinatra evening featured dinner in the Polo Lounge at his preferred table, followed by classic cocktails. These offerings commanded premium prices. Guests paid for the association, the feeling of connecting to history. But whose history? The carefully curated version. The one that emphasized beauty and excitement, that minimized darkness and compromise. The hotel had become expert at this editing, at presenting the parts of the past that enhanced current value while omitting the parts that might trouble contemporary sensibilities. Social media intensified this dynamic. Instagram transformed the pink facade into one of the most photographed buildings in Los Angeles. Thousands of visitors arrived not to stay, but to capture images and to post proof they had been there. Each photograph reinforced the brand. Each post served as free marketing. The hotel encouraged this, created photo opportunities, maintained the garden specifically for visual appeal. The images that spread across social media showed perfection. Pastel walls against blue sky, palm trees and flowers, elegant architecture. What they did not show was the infrastructure behind the beauty. The massive staff required to maintain 12 acres of gardens. The constant renovation needed to preserve aging buildings, the security systems, the insurance costs, the regulatory compliance. This selective visibility was intentional. The hotel had learned that mystery enhanced value, that revealing too much diminished mystique. The business model depended on maintaining a gap between appearance and reality. The pink facade was real, the lush gardens were real, but the work required to sustain them remained invisible, just as the work required to maintain celebrity privacy had once remained invisible. The transformation of scandal into allure happened gradually. Stories that had once been whispered as warnings became anecdotes shared as entertainment. The bungalow where Hughes had isolated himself was now marketed as historic. Guests could request to stay there, to sleep where a billionaire had slowly dissolved. The tragedy had become a selling point. This was not unique to the Beverly Hills Hotel. The hospitality industry understood that dark history, properly framed, attracted guests. Hotels haunted by ghosts, mansions where murders occurred, theaters where famous performers died. All these locations learned to monetize tragedy, to transform pain into product. The ethical questions were rarely asked. Should profit be made from suffering? Should history be edited to enhance commercial value? Should institutions that enabled harmful systems be allowed to rebrand without accountability? The questions existed, but asking them would disrupt the business model. The hotel's marketing materials from the 2000s reveal the strategy. Phrases like timeless elegance and legendary discretion appeared frequently, both technically accurate, both missing crucial context. Timeless suggested continuity, obscured change. Legendary implied fame, avoided infamy. Discretion sounded like service, ignored what it had protected. Language mattered. The hotel employed writers who understood how to frame history favorably, how to acknowledge past glamour without admitting past compromise, how to celebrate the building without examining the system it represented. Every brochure, every website, every press release, all carefully worded to present the mythology without the machinery. The question becomes whether the truth has been absorbed into the myth, whether the actual history of the Beverly Hills Hotel still exists or has been replaced by the story the hotel tells about itself, whether future generations will know what really happened or only the curated version presented to enhance brand value. The answer is probably both. The factual history exists in archives, in legal documents, in the memories of former staff, in investigative journalism, but that history is not accessible to most guests. They experience the myth. They stay in rooms decorated with vintage photographs. They eat in the Polo Lounge, surrounded by Hollywood memorabilia. They absorb the carefully constructed narrative. And for most purposes, that narrative is the history. Because history is not just what happened, it is what we remember, what we choose to preserve, what we present to others. The Beverly Hills Hotel has shaped its history through selective memory, through strategic omission, through the business of remembering only what serves current interests. This is not unique. It is how institutions survive, how brands endure, how buildings outlast the people who built them and the systems they served. Memory gets edited, rough edges smoothed, complications minimized. What remains is the version that works, that sells, that allows the present to profit from the past without being burdened by it. The Beverly Hills Hotel mastered this process. It took a history of complicity and transformed it into heritage. Took a system built to hide scandal and rebranded it as legendary discretion. Took buildings designed to enable moral compromise and marketed them as architectural treasures. Whether this represents wisdom or erasure depends on what you value: preservation or honesty, continuity or accountability, beauty or truth. The hotel chose preservation, continuity, beauty. And in making those choices, it survived. But survival has a cost, even when that cost is just the truth. Chapter 12. What the pink walls still conceal. The hotel still stands, glowing under California sun, as if nothing ever happened inside. More than a century after construction began, the Beverly Hills Hotel continues to operate. Room rates now start at $700 per night. Bungalows command between $2,000 and $6,000. The property generates estimated annual revenue exceeding $100 million. Yet occupancy averages 83%. These numbers represent success by any conventional measure. But numbers cannot capture everything. The pink facade still glows. The banana leaf wallpaper still decorates the halls. The bungalows still offer privacy, but the meaning has shifted. What was once a functioning system for managing scandal is now a luxury brand trading on nostalgia. The transformation is complete. The Palace of Secrets has become a palace of memories, a carefully curated memories. Walk the property today and you see manicured perfection. 12 acres of gardens maintained by a staff of 43. 208 rooms and 23 bungalows kept pristine by housekeepers who work in shifts around the clock. The Polo Lounge serves 300 guests daily during peak season. The infrastructure operates with mechanical efficiency. Everything functions exactly as designed. But stand in Bungalow 5 and the atmosphere changes. This is where Howard Hughes spent 4 years in isolation, where a billionaire slowly disappeared while the world continued around him. The room has been renovated multiple times since 1970. New furniture, fresh paint, modern amenities. Yet something persists. a weight in the air, a sense of history that renovation cannot erase. Staff members who work the property long enough develop a relationship with this weight. They feel it in certain rooms, sense it in quiet moments. Most do not talk about it, do not describe it, but they know it exists. The building remembers in ways that transcend decoration. The question that haunts the hotel is whether acknowledgement equals accountability, whether preserving a building preserves the systems it enabled, whether you can separate architectural beauty from moral compromise. The Beverly Hills Hotel has tried. It markets heritage while minimizing harm, celebrates glamour while obscuring mechanism, profits from history while controlling narrative. This strategy has succeeded commercially. The property thrives. Guests arrive from around the world. They pay premium rates. They post photographs. They participate in the mythology. Most have no idea what happened in these rooms decades ago. They see beauty, experience luxury, leave satisfied. But some guests arrive with knowledge. They have read the histories, studied the scandals, understood the systems. They walk the property differently. They see the separate entrances and understand their purpose. They notice the service corridors and imagine who used them. They stand in the polo lounge and picture the fixers conducting business over lunch. These informed guests face a choice: enjoy the beauty while acknowledging the darkness, or reject the experience as morally compromised. Most choose the first option. They separate the building from its history, appreciate the architecture while condemning the system, stay in rooms where terrible things happened, and sleep soundly. This compartmentalization is human. It allows enjoyment without approval, pleasure without endorsement. The hotel facilitates this compartmentalization by presenting edited history, by emphasizing certain stories while omitting others, by creating an experience that feels divorced from consequence. The pink walls do not show scars. The gardens do not reveal graves. The bungalows do not speak of what they witnessed. But concealment is the hotel's original function. It was built to hide, to protect, to maintain appearance regardless of reality. That purpose never changed. It only evolved. Now the hotel conceals its own past, protects its own reputation, maintains its appearance as heritage landmark rather than former infrastructure for scandal management. The legacy question lingers. What does this story reveal about ambition, power, and moral compromise? The Beverly Hills Hotel demonstrates how systems of power protect themselves, how wealth purchases silence, how architecture can become complicit in wrongdoing, how institutions outlast accountability by controlling memory. But it also reveals resilience. The hotel survived bankruptcy, boycotts, cultural shifts that should have rendered it obsolete. It adapted without fundamentally changing, maintained its core identity while adjusting presentation. This is how power endures. Not through dominance, but through flexibility. Not through force, but through careful narrative management. The final scale paragraph captures the magnitude. 112 years of continuous operation. Over 300,000 room nights sold annually. Estimated $100 million in current revenue. 12 acres of maintained gardens. 231 rooms and suites. 700 permanent employees across all shifts. In 2,000 celebrity guests documented over the decades. Millions of ordinary guests whose stays passed without incident or record. These numbers represent scale, continuity, success measured in decades and dollars. But they do not measure impact. Do not quantify the lives affected, the careers protected, the scandals contained, the truth suppressed. Those numbers exist only in fragments, in sealed legal files, in memories that die with the people who hold them, in stories whispered but never proven. If beauty can be built on silence, what does that say about the dreams we choose to protect? The Beverly Hills Hotel forces that question. Its existence proves that concealment can be profitable, that selective memory can be marketed, that institutions built on morally questionable foundations can endure if they control their own narrative. This is not unique to the hotel. Every historic building carries contradictions, yet every preserved landmark omits uncomfortable truths. The difference is scale. The Beverly Hills Hotel was not incidentally complicit. It was systematically designed to enable what it now omits from its history. The pink walls still conceal, not scandals anymore. Those have mostly faded into rumor and speculation. What the walls conceal now is the truth about their own purpose. The reason they were built this thick. The reason the bungalows sit so far apart. The reason discretion became the defining characteristic. The hotel will likely stand for another century. The facade will be repainted, the gardens replanted, the infrastructure updated. Each generation of guests will experience the mythology, will pay for the association with glamour, will photograph the pink walls and tropical gardens. Most will never know what really happened here, but some will. Some will read the histories, study the systems, understand that this beautiful building was once a machine for hiding truth, that its loveliness was purchased with silence, that its survival depends on selective memory. And those people will face the question that defines the Beverly Hills Hotel. Can you enjoy beauty built on concealment? Can you separate aesthetic achievement from moral compromise? Can a palace of secrets become anything other than what it was? The hotel does not answer these questions. It simply exists, pink and perfect under California sun, offering luxury to those who can afford it, providing privacy to those who desire it, maintaining discretion as if discretion were still the service rather than the liability. The walls still conceal, not shame anymore. History, the real history, the uncomfortable history, the history that might complicate the brand. But history persists in archives, in memory, in the weight that lingers in certain rooms, in the knowledge that buildings, unlike scandals, cannot be buried. They stand as evidence, as monuments, as warnings. The Beverly Hills Hotel stands, glowing, beautiful, profitable, silent, exactly as designed.